Dear Indian friends, greetings from Bell'Italia 88 and welcome back. I'm Caterina Brazzi Castracane, I am an historian and I am here in collaboration with the Italian Cultural Center in New Delhi to share with you another appointment dedicated to the rediscovery of some wonderful cities in Italy. And today, for the same reasons, we are going to talk about Matera, a wonderful town in our south, and actually a city that you can imagine completely made of stones. We are going to discover together why this is possible. First of all, it's probably important to start remembering where exactly Matera stands, because today we are flying to discover together a small territory in our south, a territory formerly called Basilicata, important during the centuries when it was, together with the other important regions that surround it, part of the important kingdoms that were organized there during the centuries. And actually, this territory is full of important examples of small cultural villages, including Melfi and Venosa. And also, this is a region full of natural elements, partially protected by our state with the national parks. Actually, the territory is dominated by the presence of two important towns. First of all, Matera, the ancient capital and considered among the ancient cities in the world, and Potenza, actually the actual capital and considered the economical capital of this territory. Territory with also a specific link with a long tradition about enogastronomy, because this territory still today produced important products protected with specific brands in Italy and part of the enogastronomical heritage of our state. Matera is the myth of this territory, a city that you are now discovering with this panoramic view and worldwide famous for different reasons. First of all, for the peculiarities of the morphology of this territory, full of natural caves used during the centuries, unfortunately, as the perfect residences for poor people. But also, the city is famous for its development during the centuries, because you have to imagine that this city was able during the times to transform itself from being a poor example of a city in our south to being an important historical and cultural city, full of architectural and artistical masterpieces realized during the same centuries when it was poor and not so famous. You have to imagine that Matera is basically composed of two cities in one, because the top of the city is dominated by a neighborhood called the Civita, completely transformed during the modern age when it was the most representative part of this city that at that time was the capital of Basilicata. But still today, below the Civita, we can find two hemicycles of stones in Italian called Sassi, respectively the Sasso Barisano to the north and the Sasso Caveoso to the south, a sort of labyrinth of superimposed houses used, as I said before, as the perfect residences for poor people for a long period until the 20th century. The origin of this settlement probably started during the ancient times, in particular when, during the Paleolithic time, the nomadic populations found refuge in the natural caves existing in the realms typically of the Murgia area. The Murgia area is the area where Matera stands, and the realms quickly became the perfect set of prehistoric villages where people used to live in caves, a habit, as I said before, that continued until the 20th century. And there's a separation between two cities in one, probably started since the Middle Age, when the word Sassi appears in some documents of that time to indicate inhabited stony areas. Since that moment, the civita was destined to be the aristocratical part of Matera, full of important public buildings, including the Cathedral and other important examples of huge architecture realized during the modern age, while the area of the Sassi was destined to be the neighborhood of poor people, with amazing example of cave houses where families lived together with animals, and also building important example of rock churches destined to become later the heart of the artistical heritage of this town. The tragic living conditions of these poor people really emerged after the Second World War, when something about 15,000 people lived in 3,300 rooms. And to help in particular the development of this part of Matera really contributed the publication of a masterpiece of the Italian literature, Christ Stopped at Eboli, written by Carlo Levi during his permanence in Basilicata. In this case, you have to remember that Carlo Levi, the man that you can see on the right side of this photograph, was a doctor, a writer, and also a painter, who was sentenced by the fascism to confinement in Basilicata in the year 1935. And during his experience there, he was also able to write this autobiographical novel, considered a journey to discover the peasant society of the south of Italy. After him, also the photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson really contributed to the destiny of this city, because he published in the year 1951 an important photographic reportage dedicated to the Basilicata. And after that moment, the Italian politician Palmiro Togliatti called Matera the shame of Italy. This moment is the real turning point for the destiny of Matera. And after that moment, the Italian state decided to work for the rehabilitation of this town. The Italian state works in this direction with two different kind of works. First of all, after the promulgation of the special law 619, which established the rehabilitation area in two phases, the inhabitants of this area were transferred to new neighbors, and then the recovery of the architectural heritage was chosen. And after a long period of restoration, the Sassi were declared a UNESCO Heritage Site in the year 1993, and in particular in the year 2019, the city was chosen as the capital of culture. And since this moment, this wonderful city became a new and modern myth of our south. The area of the Sassi is basically situated, as you can notice using this photograph, around the area of the sea that is here in this part at the top of the area. And even if the different example of caves, houses realized inside these two hemicycles during the centuries were built in different way in different moments, I would like to share with you the idea that this part of the city is a sort of perfect and unique labyrinth where it's also wonderful to get lost among superimposed houses completely curved into the turf. This is the reason why Matera is considered the city of stones, because the inhabitants of that part of Matera really carved the rocks to create houses, and also important example of rock churches considered the most representative example of the artistical transformation in Matera between the Middle and the Modern Age. To arrive in this strange part of the town, you can do the so-named Strada dei Sassi. Actually, the only way that you can do by car to arrive there, and actually opened in the year 1935. From here, you can admire the most representative examples of cave houses and churches realized during the centuries, and now declared the most representative part of the artistical heritage of this city. First of all, the church of Santa Maria de Armenis, famous for two different reasons. First of all, because this ancient church, probably built at the end of the 11th century, was built for the will of the Armenian community in Matera. And this aspect helps us to understand that Matera during that time was a wonderful and hospitable crossroads of different cultures. But the church was also built according to the Romanesque style so popular during that moment, and it was built to be a part of an important Benedictine monastery organized around the Armenian community. Also, the interior was completely carved in the turf and transformed into an important place for the prayers. And in this case, unfortunately, we have no traces of the huge decoration realized inside to emphasize the religious aspect of this wonderful part of Matera. The same destiny of other example of ancient churches unfortunately transformed during the next centuries according to other artistical taste. But not so far from here, we can find another wonderful example of this kind of rock church, Madonna dell'Idris, considered a myth among all these example of a religious building. In this case, the church was completely carved inside this huge stone called by the inhabitants of Matera Mount Errone, and inside it, only taking a small corridor to the left of the major altar, we can find another holy space called San Giovanni in Monterrone, a sort of underground room completely excavated in the fortress and used first as a baptistry and then as a burial place. These amazing spaces were completely decorated with frescoes dedicated to emphasize the faith of the poor people and dedicated to celebrate the figures of the major saints, God, and also the Holy Virgin Mary. In particular, inside this church, we can admire the wonderful representation of Cristo Pantocrator, the man and god who really created everything, with a specific icon of the Holy Virgin Mary, the so named Madonna Odigitria, only the Greek interpretation of a word that means the one who guides the way. And you can imagine all the prayer in front of this representation of the Holy Virgin Mary, praying to have an help to survive to the dramatic condition of the everyday life. Not so far from here, we can find another wonderful example of an ancient church, in this case redesigned during the modern age. I am talking about San Pietro Caveoso, actually this wonderful church situated below Santa Maria dell'Idris. And in this case, we are talking about a church that was, as I said before, completely retransformed until the 18th century, with, in this case, the addition of this spire bell tower. The interior completely transformed, still today house instead important example of artistical masterpieces, including an important example of false wooden ceiling realized during the 18th century. But the masterpieces hidden inside this church are two. First of all, an important polyptych realized by an anonymous painter from Matera during the 16th century, and in this case dedicated to celebrate the figures of the Holy Virgin Mary enthroned with the child and surrounded by the saints Saint Peter and Saint Paul. And together with this polyptych, we can find a 13th century baptismal font reused here as part of the ancient elements linked with the past of this church and destined to emphasize the artistical development so typical in particular in Matera during that centuries. Not so far from here we can find the perfect example of a cave house, the Casa Grotta di Vico Solitario, a sort of reconstruction of a typical house carved into the rock, used as a museum with furnishings and all the different elements linked with the everyday life of these poor people, constricted to live together with the animals inside only one room. This museum is the perfect place where it's possible to reflect about the really conditions where the people used to live until the 20th century. And from here we can arrive to discover another myth of this area called Sassi, the church of Santa Lucia alle Malve, formerly called Santa Lucia al Castelnuovo, but today a church that bears the same name of the district where it stands, Malve. In English only the name Malve, the spontaneous plants that grows in the surroundings. In this case, the church that is not possible to recognize from the outside was built between the 9th and the 13th centuries and used by a community of Benedictine nuns as a place of worship attached to their monastery. In this case, the interior is an amazing example of the typical life in Matera during the past, because the layout of this basilica was designed around three different naves, but only the one on the right was consecrated because the other one were used as the perfect residences for these poor people inside this city. And in this case, the naves were divided by studded pillars, completely decorated with frescoes, dedicated to emphasize also in this case the figures of saints and the figures of the Holy Virgin Mary. In this case, the amazing and most remarkable fresco that you can admire inside this church is a fresco dedicated to the Holy Virgin Mary with a child called Madonna della Bruma, because in this case the Madonna is nursing Christ. This wonderful ancient fresco, realized probably by an important master, Rinaldo da Taranto, at the end of the 13th century, really transformed the traditional iconography linked with the Holy Virgin Mary, destined since that moment to be represented in this act while she is nursing Christ, and destined for the same reason to be the perfect interpretation of the woman who protect the mothers and the children in all the different parts of the world. In the area of the Sassi, we can find also an amazing museum housed inside an ancient palace, Palazzo Pomerici, nicknamed the Palace of 100 Rooms. In this case, the museum is called MUSMA, that just means a Museum of Contemporary Sculpture in Matera, and organized there since the year 2006. Between all the different rooms, modern rooms, underground rooms, and courtyard, here there is an important collection of contemporary sculptures composed of something about 500 different works realized by important artists during the 20th centuries. And among all these artists, we have to name in particular Arturo Martini, one of the most important interpreter of the sculpture of the first part of the 20th century. But together with him, we can find Antonietta Raphael, an artist that was also a wife of an important painter of the 20th century, Mario Maffei. The brothers Dino and Mirko Basaldella, considered the real interpreters of a new interpretation of sculpture realized during the second part of the 20th century, together with Maria Lai, an amazing artist coming from Sardinia and destined to transform definitely the idea of the contemporary art in Italy. This museum is also the tangible proof that in Matera still today is possible to admire important example of artistical masterpieces realized not only in the past but also during the contemporary times. To end this first part of this short lecture, we have to remember that this amazing town full of something spiritual and magical in the air was chosen during the 20th century and more by important important cinema directors to be the perfect stage of important films. In particular, among them, it's important to remember Pierpaolo Pasolini, who shot there the Vangelo secondo Matteo, and who was destined to be a myth of our estate, but also the American director Mel Gibson, who shot there the Passion of Christ. Pierpaolo Pasolini decided to shoot this film in Matera when was so famous and clear that was impossible not to shoot it in Palestine. And after that moment, Pasolini chose Matera as his private Jerusalem, and so the emphasis that he put shooting this film was remarked, looking for specific view of this city considered so similar to the capital of the religions situated still today in Israel. The same was chosen by Mel Gibson, who decided here to shoot an important and strange film dedicated to the Passion of Christ, completely acted in Aramaic, Hebrew and Latin. And in this case, the film quickly became famous for the realism and also for the terrible feelings of the dramatic epilogue of Christ during the last part of his life, so represented inside this city at the starting point of the 21st century. And in this case, with this amazing film, Matera really became a myth also of the contemporary life that you can discover getting lost also in the upper part of this town, in the Civita, considered the modern part of Matera, organized in squares and streets, and also full of important monuments linked with the heritage, in particular of the modern age. One of the best places where you can start your peregrinations around the streets of this part of Matera is Piazza Pascoli, a wonderful balcony overlooking all the rest of the city and dominated by the presence of this important and wonderful 17th century palace. I am talking about Palazzo Lanfranchi, actually built for the will of the Archbishop Vincenzo Lanfranchi as a seminary in the year 1668, and later expanded to be transformed after the unification of Italy into a school in which, and this is interesting for us, thought also the poet Giovanni Pascoli between the year 1882 and the year 1884. Today, this wonderful palace is considered one of the most important museums in Matera, with two different entrances. First of all, the left entrance on the main facade, originally the access to the Chiesa del Carmine, and actually transformed recently in an important space for temporary exhibitions, while the central portal leads inside the palace that is now the home of the National Museum of Medieval and Modern Art and also of the Carlo Levi Center. And here actually there is another masterpiece realized by Carlo Levi, in this case an artistical masterpiece called Lucania 61, a huge canvas completely painted by Carlo Levi in occasion of a huge exposition organized in Turin in the year 1961 to celebrate the first centenary of the unification of Italy and dedicated to the history of Basilicata. You can consider this amazing canvas more than 18 meters long and 3 meters height, a sort of song composed of 3 different parts and dedicated to this region in transition between past and future, still in that part of the 20th century. One part of this important artistical masterpiece was dedicated to the figures of Rocco Scotellaro, an important man who was born in Basilicata and considered a peasant poet. Actually, Scotellaro was a socialist writer, friend of Levi and other important intellectuals of that time, but he was also for a short time the mayor of Tricarico, a small village not so far from Matera, where he really worked to resolve different problems linked with the peasant society and also for the alphabetization of the poor people who lived there with not more money. And in this case, Scotellaro, who died unfortunately at the age of 30, was transformed into a myth of this territory. And still today, these figures is emphasized with other artistical masterpieces, in this case works of street art. In this case we are seeing a masterpiece realized in Tricarico to celebrate the myth of Scotellaro, that is considered a sort of alive figures destined to protect the destiny of this part of Italy. Probably the most remarkable building in the central part of the city is the Cathedral, built during the 13th century according to the Apulian Romanesque style and reopened in the year 2016 after an important works of restoration. In this case, the façade is completely dominated by these important elements linked with the Romanesque style, different pilasters, and in particular a rose window made up of 16 spokes with 3 figures in the act of turning this strange well that is a perfect and clear reference to the wheel of life. The figures who dominated this wheel is the representation of Saint Michael, considered an important saint of this city and in general of the south. Here you can find also the perfect representation of other statues and also animals, as in the case of one of the lateral entrance of the cathedral, remarked by the presence of this cuspidated pork that is held by these 2 different figures. The interior was unfortunately completely redesigned during the Baroque time, and it was originally organized around around a Latin cross. Inside it we can find traces of the original decoration used to emphasize the power of the cathedral in this part of the city, and in particular at the beginning of the right aisles we can notice this fresco probably realized by the master Rinaldo da Taranto, dedicated to the theme of the Last Judgment, so popular during the Middle Age. In this case, probably the fresco was realized during the 13th century. But the Cathedral is also remarked by this important apse, dominated first of all by an important altar that arrived there from the Abbey of Monte Scaglioso, and surmounted by an important altarpiece, realized in this case by Fabrizio Santafede during the second part of the 16th century, and dedicated to the Virgin Mary and the saints. In this case, you can notice the typical representation of the Holy Virgin Mary surrounded by angels in the higher part of the altarpiece, while the saints are represented on the earth in a separated part of the representation from the Holy Virgin Mary that is here depicted in the eternal life in the sky. But we can find also this example of wooden chair carved by Giovanni Tantino in the year 1353 with biblical scenes, animals, and different kind of figures. There are also other two important masterpieces inside this cathedral. First of all, a wonderful nativity scene realized probably by Altobello Persio with San Nazaro di Alessano in the year 1534, and dedicated to emphasize the link between the nativity and the shepherds, so important for Matera. In this case, you can notice all the feelings of pace that really this nativity can emanate as the most representative celebration of the poor life of shepherds that were able also to emphasize the night of Christmas. And also you can find another amazing celebration of faith, an icon of the Holy Virgin Mary again, in this case called Madonna della Bruma, a fresco probably realized by Giovanni da Taranto at the end of the 13th century, and considered the most representative icon of this Madonna that is the main saint protector this city. And in particular, to celebrate this Madonna every year on July the 2nd, the city of Matera celebrates it with a specific feast organized with a different moment. First of all, during the past, with the important procession of shepherds destined to emphasize their rule before going to the pastures. Today, the feast is organized around this important statue that is carrying in procession together with the knights lined up in defense of air. The procession is organized in different steps during the day until the moment when the statue is recollocated inside the Duomo, and the cart goes in the direction of the Corso to be there are completely attacked and dismembered by the citizen in memory of a popular revolt of the past and also as a sign of good luck. Later, during the night, the feast ended with important fireworks organized to illuminate the area of stones and all the rains. The feast is also in this case, and we are going to end this short lecture, the occasion when it's possible to rediscover the amazing enogastronomical wonders linked with the territory of Matera and the Basilicata in general. And among the typical products of this land, we can remember first of all the bread of Matera, worldwide famous for the flavor and the taste, but also the crusty peppers used to cook amazing dishes linked with the ancient traditions, but also a specific example of salami called the pezzente salami from Matera Mountains and considered today a slow food presidium. Slow food is the Italian label for traditional food. All these elements help the citizen of Basilicata to realize the amazing traditional dishes, really inspired by ancient recipes, handed down from generation to generation as a memory of the table. All these dishes are wonderful if you taste it with the amazing Matera dark wines, considered another wonderful product of this famous but amazing and wonderful territory. The enogastronomical aspects are other important reasons to discover this part of our south, part that was able to transform itself from being a poor part of Italy to being a sort of masterpiece situated in an open air museum. And at this point I stop sharing with you my screen to say thank you very much for your attention. We will see again to talk about other amazing examples of cultural cities in Italy. The other one we had talked about before are visible on the YouTube channel of the Italian Cultural Institute in New Delhi. And so thank you very much. See you the next time for other and new adventures. Bye bye.